This is the Building Automation Monthly Podcast with Phil Zito, episode 136. Hey folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to episode 136 of the Building Automation Monthly Podcast. In this episode, we are going to be talking about how to organize your building automation team for success. So there's going to be a lot to this episode before we even get to the 5 decisions you need to make in order to build your automation team. So buckle up. This is going to be a very in-depth episode. So first off, before we ever even think about how we structure our building automation team, or for most of you listening to this, restructure your building automation team, we have to ask ourselves, what does success even mean for our building automation team? Now, it's easy for us to refer to financial metrics. Our executed margin. We want to make sure that we execute our projects at the forecasted margin or even better than the forecasted margin. We want to make sure that we do not have negative slippage. That means that the project costs more than we actually estimated it would. And we would like to have positive slippage, but we want to be careful there, because if we are getting too high of executed margin or too much positive slippage, then that means we probably overestimated our project, and that can reduce our win rate of projects if we are actually going and bidding projects using kind of plan and spec methods. And if we have so much money in the project that we have positive slippage every time and positive executed margin, while that's good for the books, that means that we're probably missing out on booking work. And then we also have projected versus actual costs. So looking at kind of the 3 buckets that we tend to break out on any given BAS project. And those 3 buckets tend to be our actual technical labor costs, our subcontractor costs, and our product costs. Those tend to be the 3 buckets we look at when we are managing a project. Now, I realize also that some of you do service and operations work, and these things can still apply. For example, your ability to go and execute retrofit work, or your ability to go and quickly perform planned service work, things like that. Those all have financial metrics tied to them. One of the things that we don't tend to focus on, though, when we're looking at success of our team, is the relational metrics. I mean, financial metrics are easy to measure. Relational metrics are much harder. Are we getting future work from this customer, either in the form of going and getting additional work, or maybe the customer requesting change orders to enhance the project, post-warranty service work, looking and saying, hey, come look at this other building. We've got an old system in it. We want you to help us work this up and tie it into our system. Those are all areas that are relational metrics. There's no necessarily financial tie to them. I guess you could argue, how much extra cash do you get? How much quote unquote share of wallet do you get from the customer? And we can also look at spec inclusion. Are we being included in future specs? Are we being flat spec'd in future specs? I know some of you listening to this are thinking that this stuff is kind of salesy, but this is what you need to look at from a business perspective, because you can't just be good at managing operations. You've got to be basically building the relationship with your current customers so that you can have future work, because there are a lot of cranes up right now at the time of this recording in October of 2018. However, in the future, there may not be cranes. We all remember 2008 when all these funded projects started to shut down. And the only thing that carried a lot of companies through were their relationships on the operations and service side with their customers. So you may be asking yourself, why does this stuff matter? And it matters because of one really important point. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to maybe lose weight or get better at some form of physical activity. And I've done it a lot because I like food. And I was realizing that Until I started to measure things, I didn't see as much success. And that's true in business as well. If you don't have a baseline, then you have nothing to determine whether the changes you are making are having any effect. I want to repeat that because it's very important, because we're often living so much by the seat of our pants that we don't sit there and think about this. And this is true not only of organizing your building automation team, but this is also true of becoming a better technician, becoming a better salesperson, becoming a better manager. If you have no baseline, if you have no performance metrics, if you have nothing to show where you're at, then you can do anything, because you're never going to know if what you're doing is successful. You can feel like it's successful, but you have no empirical proof. Now, here's the deal. That may be fine for kind of personal changes, but when you're talking about changing a business, there are so many factors that can impact your business that you have to have a baseline. So how do you establish a baseline? Well, typically how you establish a baseline is you will define tasks. This is why I really recommend logging tasks, like coming up with task categories for your technicians to charge their time towards. Back when I was a technician, I used to hate charging my time towards tasks because it just seemed like a pain in the butt to remember all these different tasks. I didn't realize, though, that was super important, because without understanding task efficiency, what we're spending too much time on and what we're spending not enough time on and what we're really efficient at, management had no way to determine how to train us, had no way to determine where to invest training efforts. So as you're sitting there getting ready to go and organize your team and figure out kind of how you're going to structure things, that is one area, right? So remember our 3 buckets: labor, subcontractors, and products. Products, that's something you have limited control on, because most of you listening do not have large enough volume to impact manufacturers. Some of you do. Some of you are larger companies, and that's awesome. Some of you are not. That's not a dig. That's not a negative. It's just, let's focus where we can actually impact. And we can impact subcontracting, and we can impact our own labor. It's kind of hard to change the price of a thermostat. So with that being said, as I mentioned, we first need to have our baseline for labor. We do that by identifying our key tasks and then using some sort of system, I'm not going to get into systems, to identify those tasks and log those tasks against a project. That is something I would always do back when I was managing operations, is I would make sure that my technicians understood how much time they had for each task. That's really important, because when you're properly measuring tasks, you can see who's efficient, and that is not what I don't want you to do, is see who's efficient and use that as a beating stick. No, that is not the purpose of this. The purpose is to understand who's not efficient and figure out why they're not efficient, because most likely you didn't give them processes to be efficient or the training to be efficient, and then go and correct that through processes and training. I'm going to let you in on a little secret here. Most of what we do comes down to about 5 to 7 tasks on a project, right? We go and we create control submittals. We go and then we line out a subcontractor based on those control submittals. Subcontractor installs it, or maybe you do in-house install. We do point-to-point checkout. We map the stuff in. We create some graphics. We download some programs. We go and do a checkout, maybe a functional test, and we call it a day. Yes, I'm grossly simplifying the project process, but I think a lot of folks go so deep into the weeds that they don't realize there's a couple processes, if you trained folks on, will have a dramatic impact. And that'll be a future episode where we go through processes and just kind of strategies around that. But here's the thing. You need to establish a baseline for your labor. You also need to do that for your subs as well. You have no way of knowing if your subs are being efficient, if they are properly installing things. And when I say subs, a lot of you here are thinking electrical. You're thinking electrical subs. But what you don't realize, in today's economy, you can have subcontracted programmers, subcontracted graphics outfits. You can have subcontracted installers. The beauty of having a global economy, of having access to worldwide labor, is that there's a lot of stuff you can get. And this can allow even smaller controls companies to scale, and this can allow larger controls companies to scale. A lot of the larger controls companies use labor from India, they use labor from Malaysia, from over in Asia area. And the reason they do that is because of the difference between salary here in the US and salary over there. It's just, that is why, just a segue for those of you who are technicians and you're listening and you got a little upset about that, don't get me wrong. I'm as pro-American as can be, but I'm also a business owner, and I realize that there's certain skilled labor that you absolutely want to have here. And that's why I'm always advocating for technicians to level up their skills as much as possible. But there's certain things that are so routine, certain things that are so generic, that you need to take advantage of those cost benefits. And you need to be aware of that. That's just reality. There's a reason why, whether you like it or not, Walmart is so big, because they take advantage of low-priced goods from over in Asia. That's just the reality of economics and business. So if you want to be able to scale your business, you need to think of those kind of things. So where were we going with this? We were talking about baselining, right? Well, baselining your subcontractors, understanding your graphics labor, understanding your design labor, understanding your electrical installation labor, being able to have baselines of that, understanding how much that typically costs. Not only will these baselines assist your sales team in being more accurate in their estimates, but it will also ensure that you're able to understand how your business is doing. So with this all being said, we come back to the main question of the episode, right? How do you organize a BAS team? Well, we have to have some clarity on roles within that team, right? Because if everyone was the quarterback, or if everyone was the running back, that wouldn't be a very effective football team. Would you agree with that? We have to have role clarity. Being former military, very much about role clarity, understanding if something happened, who did what. And that is what made an organized unit effective, was that there was role clarity. Now, I tend to find that groups break out into either two kind of structures. One is everyone does a little bit of everything. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as you're aware of it, because once again, it's about processes. And then there is one where they run it kind of like a conveyor belt, where you have certain people who do certain things. But what are those things? So first, let's take a look at a construction team. Now, a typical construction team consists of 5 roles, and that would be installers. And depending on how you run your shop, the installers could be also doing the electrical, or they could simply be going and validating that electrical install, controller mounting, trunk wiring was all done right. But the installer's purpose, and this is something that we cover heavily in our BAS startup and checkout course, is to go and make sure that the controls are getting installed, okay? That is the installer. Now, in some cases, the installer and our next role, the technician, are the same person. Remember, I said that sometimes you all will use in-house labor to do installation? Well, in that case, the technician would be the same person as the installer, but most organizations I run to actually keep this separated. And the reason why is, unless you're a fairly established controls company, the risk of having electrical install, just the cost and you bearing any mistakes that are made, can be quite high. So a lot of folks will choose to sub that risk out to a subcontractor who's more experienced in installation. Plus, then they don't have to keep installers on staff. Next, you have technicians. And technicians, their purpose is to actually validate that everything was installed. They'll go and download programs, configure systems, create graphics, map in points. They do essentially all of the software side of the things we cover in our BAS startup and checkout course. So they cover everything from the controller's mounted, it's COM, it's wired up. We're going to pull it into a supervisory device. We're going to map in the points, create point extensions, graphics, trends, alarms, all this jazz. And they're going to set it up according to the specification and the control submittal. Now, the designers are the ones who look at that control submittal. They look at the plans and they look at the specification, look at the plans, and they create the control submittal. And the programmers look at the sequences that are in the plans and in the specifications, and they create the programs. And the project managers oversee all of the labor that is applied to the project and ensure that proper parts, labor, and subcontracted labor are present at the right times in order to execute a project. Now that's all construction, and we'll have another episode where we talk about construction in a much deeper sense. Then we have service and operations, and this tends to consist of a relatively simple structure. You will have a dispatcher who in some cases is just someone who answers the phone. In other cases, it's actually an experienced person who will try to figure out what's going on and then dispatch the appropriate person. You tend to have technicians and then a technical lead. The technicians tend to be broken up into skill sets. So maybe you have one technician that's really good with hydronic systems, one that's really good with airside systems, one that knows BACnet, one that knows lawn. And it really just depends on your service portfolio, what customers you're servicing, what can be expected of them. That tends to dictate the structure of your service team. And then potentially you can have a retrofit team. Now, a retrofit team is kind of a hybrid of a construction team. You see, most construction teams are dealing with design build work, plan and spec work, where there's a general contractor, mechanical, and then they are under the mechanical. Retrofit tends to be direct to owner. And in this case, you act as the main contractor. So there's a lot more to it, especially on the project management side. And in some cases, you're even creating the actual engineered drawings. And in that case, you would potentially have an engineer of record on your team. Now, the lines are getting blurred a little bit with a lot of mechanical contractors now creating their own in-house controls team. So you're starting to see where project managers are over both mechanical and controls. You're starting to see technicians that are also also mechanics. And you're also starting to see some outsourced programming take place, a lot of outsourced graphics as well. So now that we understand how teams are structured, we can have our conversation about what kind of work are you doing. Now, for some of you, you already know what kind of work you're doing. So this is pretty basic, but let's still dive into it. Do you do construction? If you do construction work, what verticals do you serve? Do you do plan and spec work? Do you do design build work? Do you only do retrofit work? One of the beautiful things about running our business is that I get to talk to a lot of leaders of a bunch of different companies because we're helping to train their technical teams. I mean, we assess their teams. We then go and test their teams for technical knowledge, and then we create learning maps for their teams based on our courses. As part of this, I have to understand their business. I have to understand how they go about executing their work. And I will tell you, some customers are structured in that they focus on a specific vertical and that is their specialty. Others, they go after plan and spec work. Others do only retrofit work. It just depends. And this is really important for you to understand, because how you go about training your team on a retrofit job is going to be completely different than the skill set for plan and spec work. They're both technically construction work. They both technically follow the same processes. One, though, requires a much broader knowledge base than the other. Retrofit work requires the ability to not only execute new construction processes, but you also need to be able to do that and understand the existing systems and work new systems into existing systems. That can actually get quite complex. Now, if you do service work, you have to ask yourself, what do you service? How do you service it? Are you simply going and maybe doing retro commissioning? Are you doing analytics? Are you sitting there and actually running the operations for a customer? These are all things you need to understand, because once again, that will organize how you do your team. For example, if your service model is to augment a customer's facility team, then you need to be aware that you may have to have a lot more people, because you don't want to have to be pulling a service tech off a customer site where they're expected to be, because you don't have enough people to man your service organization. So with all of this context being in place, now you have kind of the fundamental skill knowledge for us to talk through the 5 decisions you need to make in order to build your team. So step 1, if you're starting completely from scratch, you need to decide on what type of work you will do. And this is quite possibly the most important decision you can make. For companies I've worked with that are really trying to scale up, they're stuck at maybe $1 million to $10 million in controls work. This is the single decision that, when made, has the largest impact on if they are going to succeed in scaling up their controls business. You see, you can't be everything to everyone. If you are saying, I'm going to be the dominant player in my market for healthcare work, then that requires a specific set of skills. One, you have a customer who's a 24/7 facility who has expectations on service that is going to be much higher than, your average commercial office building. And because of that, you're going to have to structure your team in a different way. You're going to have expectations of your team in a different way. You're going to have more complex systems. A hospital tends to have systems that have to be up. They tend to have redundant systems. They tend to have complex systems, high tonnage chillers, complex central plants, etc. And they also tend to be 30, 40-year facilities. So you will find that they have a lot of legacy equipment. So the skill sets that you're going to have there are completely different than if you're doing plan and spec, new build commercial real estate work. Which brings us to step 2. Once you understand what kind of work you're doing, you have to decide what will be done in-house and what will be done outside. Now, I could spend an entire episode on how to outsource control work. How do you go and manage an outsourced team? How do you manage expectations? How do you ensure quality? How do you even find people? But the important thing before you ever even get to that is understanding what tasks will be in-house and what tasks will be outside. Are you going to have in-house electricians? Are you going to do your own graphics? And this isn't just tasks. This is also tools. So for example, you can create your own graphics, or you can go to a graphics supplier, like, for example, QA Graphics. They're a graphics supplier that I've worked with in the past, and you can go to them and buy pre-made graphics libraries. So do you choose to buy a pre-made graphics library and license that in lieu of actually creating graphics from scratch? Or are you doing so much work that you want to develop your own graphics library? These are all decisions that need to be made in step 2. Now, up to this point, we haven't organized our team yet, right? Because you have to have these 2 things answered before you can ever even put a team together. I see folks often when they're trying to grow their controls business, or maybe they're mechanical and they're starting a controls business, they'll just go and say, okay, I'm going to hire a Niagara N4 advanced guy. I'm going to stick him on the job site, and they're going to go do some work. And we're just going to bid the controls for every job that comes. While that's admirable, that is a horrible strategy. That's something that is not, one, it's not sustainable. It may work for 1 or 2 projects, but once that person's on more than a couple projects, if you don't have the processes and support systems in place, you are not going to be able to go and execute that work. So you need to decide what kind of work you're going to do and what tasks are going to be done. And then and only then can you move to step 3, which is decide on how you will organize your processes. It's here that you're going to go and figure out, how are we going to execute this work? Are we going to have one person who's on the project and he's the project manager, tech, programmer, designer, and that person maybe has 3 projects and they're over that and then they have a sub electrical underneath them? Are we going to have a team of technicians and then we're going to have a design and programming pool in-house and those folks go and execute? Are we going to have a service team where we have service techs that roll out and they're supported by a remote operations center? I mean, there are so many different ways that you can organize your processes, but you need to pick one. Because if you are trying to do something different or you are trying to improve, remember, going back to our baseline model, this would be like me saying, I'm going to go on a diet and I'm going to do intermittent fasting. I'm going to do ketogenic diet. I'm also going to count calories and I'm going to do Weight Watchers. Oh, and I'm going to run and I'm also going to be doing yoga. And I mean, 1, you'll overwhelm yourself. 2, you don't know which one of those processes, which one of those steps is having impact. You need to take, and I know this, trust me, as a business owner who has created 8 courses in less than a year, I get the desire to have change now, to do it now, get it done. And that feeling inside where you feel like everyone's passing you by and you can't slow down because you've got to do it now because the opportunity is now. I get that. I totally get that. But at the same time, if you're doing everything, the opportunity may be now, but you don't know what made a difference. So when that next opportunity comes, you can't do 10x what you've achieved because you don't know what to do because you don't know what made a difference. So you really need to figure that out. Which brings us to step 4. So we figured out our processes. How do we support our processes? This is where we go and we actually start to put our team together. This is where we decide, oh, we need this many technicians. We need this many designers. We need this many programmers. Now, there's some consultants out there, some folks out there who will just tell you, look at how much you are doing in controls. So if you're doing 10 million in controls, you need to have X amount of people, like 4 techs, 1 designer, and 2 programmers. If you're doing 100 million, well, then you want to have, 10 techs, 4 designers, 4 programmers. I'm just putting numbers out there off the top of my head. The thing is, that's a horrible way to structure your business. This is a terrible idea because it doesn't take into effect context. You could do 5 hospitals that are 20 million each. I'm just saying. Or you could have, 1,000 $100,000 jobs. And do you agree that that would be a completely different structure? I hope you agree, because if you don't agree, you're lying to yourself. That would be a completely different structure that you would need from a support perspective. The ability to execute 1,000 projects versus 5 projects requires completely different support structures, different logistics, different software, different processes, and different team structure. So you need to understand what type of work you do, so that way you can decide how you support your work. And don't buy into these, because I have $10 million in controls work, I need this many guys. You need to look at the type of work you're doing, how long the projects you tend to do are, and you need to have a baseline of where you're efficient and where you're not. And that brings us to the final step right here, step number 5, which is to decide on how you'll flex. The reality is, if you execute these 4 steps, you are going to most likely see success. You can still screw it up, but most likely you will see success, because there's a lot of folks out there who don't do this. And they don't do it, and then they wonder why they're stuck at $1 million or $10 million in controls work, never getting any bigger, because they're not doing these steps. So you need to go and figure out how you're going to flex, because the last thing you want to do is get some great growth and then start trying to stretch your best tech between 10 different job sites, your best programmer, having them working 80 hours a week. They will quit They will go somewhere where someone pays them 5-10% more because at home their wife is getting upset. They're not seeing their kids. They're missing their kids' football games. And they'll stick with it for a little bit. But in today's market, no one has to deal with that. Now, this may be completely different 2 years from now, 3 years from now. But right now, if a programmer's upset or if someone is not or is getting overworked, they can go find another place where they don't have to be overworked. So you need to think through what are your growth opportunities. And this is more of an art than a science. This is something you develop over time. For lack of a better word, it's your gut. You start to be able to feel the market. You know what you have in the pipeline. You know what you're executing. You know what your backlog is. That's why you need to know your financial numbers. And then based on that information, you can determine when do you need to start bringing other people in-house. How will you flex? And sometimes that's not bringing people in-house. Sometimes that's having relationships where you can offload work. It's okay strategically to take projects and offload them because those projects may not support the greater vision of your business. All right, so for those of you who have followed up to this point, here's how you go and you execute this. Once again, you decide on what type of work you're going to do. That's your first decision. Your second decision is you decide on what tasks will be in-house and what tasks will be outside. Your third decision is you decide on how you will organize your processes. Your fourth decision is you decide on how you will support your work. And your fifth decision is you decide on how you will flex. Now, for those of you who run organizations, especially ones that do plan and spec and design build work, one of the greatest challenges you run into is finding technical labor that can go and actually execute projects. There's nothing like hiring someone, having them sit in the office, charging their time to overhead, or job shadowing, quote, quote, job shadowing, where in reality, they're just carrying someone's tools around and charging to a job. And that tends to go on for the first several months. Now, what if it didn't have to be that way? What if there was a way that within a couple weeks, you could go and have someone who's able to go execute work profitably so that you can go and revenue that backlog that you've been sitting on? What if you had a way to bring someone fresh off the street and get them out there profitably contributing to your business within the first month? Well, my friends, there is a way, and that is our new course, Building Automation Systems Startup and Checkout. In this course, students are going to learn how the entire installation, startup, and checkout process works, and they're going to learn how to do it hands-on. So what will happen is students will follow along online, and they will learn how to install controls, mount controls, wire up trunks, pull in controllers, set up the front end, set up the points, and they will learn all of the processes and procedures that they need to know. This is the prime opportunity for those of you who are looking to grow your business, who are looking to be able to execute more work, to take your more junior folks, to take your new hires, and empower them to be able to execute work as quickly as possible. So if you are trying to go and grow your business, but having folks who can execute your project work is slowing you down because you can't find them and you can't afford to hire the folks who already know how to do these kind of things, then you really need to enroll your employees in our BAS Startup and Checkout course. Right now it is open for enrollment and it will be closing down soon. It is limited to 20 people for enrollment, and you can find out more information by going to the link for this episode, which is buildingautomationmonthly.com/136. Once again, that is buildingautomationmonthly.com/136, and scrolling down to the bottom of the page and clicking on the BAS Startup and Checkout logo. All right, folks, that's it for this week. I look forward to talking to you next week. And we will be talking in next week's podcast about the topic of sales strategies that we can use to create renewable revenue for our building automation business. Thanks a ton for being here, and I look forward to talking to you all again in next week's episode. Take care.